as we got closer to the Algerian coastline, sure enough, the orange Coast Guard came to greet us. And
I'm sure they were.
Oh yeah,
they were packing.
well armed, and they thought we were a drug ship, or who knows what they thought.
Yeah,
It wasn't.
Somalians.
They didn't greet us happily, and they said, "We shall escort you from here."
So I don't know if you knew this, but we were in Stratford-on-Avon recently, and we met with Philip Beale there on the banks of the Avon River. It was significantly different than this scenery here.
Okay, yeah.
Now, what was he, the captain? I mean, what was his involvement in terms of the sailing of the Phoenician
Great
boat?
question. Philip Beale was, technically speaking, he doesn't like to refer to himself as a captain because that has a very significant role and stature in the British Navy. But he does call himself the skipper, and that's a correct, name for what he did. While as skipper or lead of the ship, we all called him captain.
Well, when as Americans, when we hear skipper, we think of skipper.
Gilligan's Island.
Yeah. So he probably doesn't want to be known as skipper here. But anyway, that's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
How did you get involved, and why? Why did you say, here's a guy who's going to take a boat halfway around the world, I'm in?
Yeah, this is kind of a crazy story. So I knew Philip from a few years prior, and now the voyage started in 2019, but I knew Philip from a few years prior because he had published a book called Sailing Close to the Wind. And that was his first book, and it detailed the first expedition that he did in this Phoenicia ship. And it actually left from Salalah, Oman, which interestingly is where we consider Nephi built his original ship.
Where Bountiful or wherever they were. Okay.
Yeah, right in that region.
So he just happened to leave from there.
Happened to leave from there. He has no awareness that there was any connection at that stage.
And what was his destination?
And his destination was to circumnavigate Africa.
Okay, because you got to go down around the Horn of Africa to even begin thinking about heading further west.
West, yeah. But his goal was to get around Africa, which was to prove the words of Herodotus, who in 500 BC wrote that Emperor Necho II, which was a pharaoh actually of Egypt, hired the Phoenicians to sail around the great continent, and that was just put out there by Herodotus. There was no evidence that it actually ever happened. And so Philip, in his way, decided he was going to set out to see if he could make that happen. So I was distributing his book here in the States.
Okay, there's the connection.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I had that connection with him. We had gone back and forth. We'd email a few times. And then he sent me a note and said that he was planning to take the same ship and cross the Atlantic to America, which was a whole new concept.
Okay, so to begin where? Same place, Oman?
No, this time it will begin in the Mediterranean. Because again, when you go back to look at the Phoenician civilization, their strongholds were all within the Mediterranean sphere.
Right, okay.
Right, Sidon, Tyre, they're two founding cities, which by the way are mentioned in the Bible quite a bit. And the cities of Sidon and Tyre.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of people ask, in fact, this is a little aside here, a lot of people say, well, if the Phoenicians were such a big deal back in biblical times, how come we never read about them in the Bible? And the reason for that is because they're not called Phoenicians in the Bible. They're actually referred to as Canaanites.
Well, and we've certainly heard of them.
Yeah. And so, and in fact, there's a wonderful tie when you go back to King Solomon. When he went to build the temple, the Lord commanded, to build this temple. He looked among his people, and they were sheep herders and farmers, and weavers. They didn't have people that built massive buildings.
Right.
And so he goes to Tyre, which is in modern day Lebanon, the city of Tyre, and hires Hiram of Tyre, and he's referenced in the early, in Kings and so on. And Hiram comes and actually builds the temple of Solomon. him and his people. So it's a Phoenician-built temple.
That's very cool.
That was the first,
Yeah.
Israelite temple in ancient Israel.
So you get a hold of Philip, and he says he's going to do. Does he invite you along, or are you
No,
saying?
not at this day. I had no idea. He just indicated that was their next plan to go across the Atlantic, and then he was invited to come and speak at a Book of Mormon conference here because of his because of the interest around sailing a ship across from
Certainly.
the old world to the new. That's
Yeah.
a big deal. So he had been invited to come to a conference. I was there at the conference and met with him for the first time, really met live, and really just hit it off with him. It turns out we're like second cousins, like 5 times removed, because we have a common ancestor in England.
That's cool.
And so anyway, we have this connection. But anyway, he came in April of 2019 and spoke at this conference. Now, he was planning to leave in September of 2019 to start this voyage. And I just invited him to dinner, he actually came to our home for breakfast while he was waiting for his flight Sunday night. And we spent the day together, and I drove him up to Snowbird to see the snow. And in April, it was still a lot of it. And on the way down, he just said, "Have you ever thought of joining my crew?" And I'm like, well, I kind of dreamed of it, but I didn't know.
Oh, so you had thought of it?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
just it's been like a childhood dream of mine because I love Thor Heyerdahl, and I read about Thor Heyerdahl back in
Right.
1972, cover to cover, the National Geographic, and I read all those issues, and I was so fascinated by
is
his
that the
voyage.
Kon-Tiki raft?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's the Ra 1, Ra 2 expeditions. Kon-Tiki left and was in the Pacific.
Oh, okay.
But Ra 1 and Ra 2 sailed from Africa to the New World.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And they were in reed boats. They weren't. And as I look back now, even though I was super intrigued by all that, it really had nothing to do with the Book of Mormon.
Sure.
Because the Book of Mormon sailed in hewn timbers, right?
Yeah.
So very different kind of ship and all that. And so when Philip Beale had this ship made out of hewn timbers that just happens to date back to 600 BC.
And he just happens to say, "Hey, have you ever thought about
like,
crewing?"
yeah.
And so, what did you say? I mean, what?
So I said, I would love to go. Now I have to talk to my wife.
And what kind of a commitment was this? And did you know how long it was going to take, and how long did it take?
Well, okay, so I didn't commit to the entire voyage, okay, to be
Okay.
clear on that. But if I had, it would have been a 5-month expedition.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you have a life
I do have a life. I do
outside
have
of
family.
childhood dream-fulfilling sea voyages.
So I did agree to do that, and then that just sent me on to a mission of trying to start training every day and getting physically fit, which I needed to do, and I did that for about 20 weeks until September, and then
because you had all summer of 2019 to get ready.
exactly.
To get ready to do what? What did he have you do? What was your role on this
there's
boat?
on board the ship, you have to have a minimum 10 to 12 crewmen at all times, just to sail the craft.
Is that
because-
maritime law, or is
No,
that
it's
just
called Phoenician ship requirements.
that's just based on the history of whatever?
No, it's just based on what it takes to sail the ship.
All right, so you're setting your own rules. We got to have 10 to 12
Well, I mean,
guys.
he learned that in his first voyage. You can't, because there's no autopilot, right? You have to-
every one of those dozen or so has a thing to do.
Oh yeah, and it changes every hour. So you're on a 6 hour shifts. So I was on the ship for 3 weeks. Okay, we sailed from Carthage, Tunisia, which is in the Mediterranean. Most people go, I have no idea where Carthage is, but if you know the boot that comes down for Italy and goes
Yes.
straight down from there, there's that point that sticks up. That's Carthage.
That's Carthage.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's northern Africa, right?
Right.
And so from there, Carthage was one of the major city centers of the Phoenicians. It was the last stronghold of the Phoenicians. In fact, they were finally conquered in 300 BC by the Romans.
Oh, it was Phoenician.
Yeah, and that was
Okay.
Phoenician.
I
Yeah.
did not realize
Well, they didn't call themselves Phoenicians either. They were Carthaginians.
Okay.
Very proud of their Carthaginian heritage.
Yeah.
But they were part of that Phoenician empire, a city-state empire that existed.
So you met him there.
So yes,
how
we
long
met.
had they been at sea when they got to Carthage to pick
He
you-
had sailed from his home in UK, Southampton area, and sailed the ship all the way down into the Mediterranean until finally got to Carthage. Then we could begin the expedition.
and start kind of heading back.
So he had a kind of a random crew that he had pulled together just to do that trip. and then he started with the official crew in September to do the voyage across the
And so
Atlantic.
were you just an honorary, temporary crew member? Is that how that worked for 3 weeks? If he's
Essentially,
taking
yeah.
5 months and
Yep.
you're,
There was only a handful that actually were on the entire voyage. There was, at every stop, there would be changes of crew, right?
Okay.
And so they would come and go. Like while I was on, there were several changes of crew.
so he didn't really paint a great picture about the actual onboard experience for us, as I recall, especially from the perspective of a non-skipper from a Gilligan
Yeah.
or a Ginger, you know.
Probably.
What was it like? I mean, how true to history, how, were there luxuries on board? Did somebody bring a hibachi or, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
or what, did he try to keep it as Spartan as possible?
It was kept as close to authentic as possible in the 21st century.
Okay.
And so that involves a few things. But just to give you an idea of what the Carthaginians would have used back in 600 BC, they had on board a fireplace where they'd cooked food. So that, a bricked oven where they would burn wood and cook food. So that was actually a thing.
Wow.
Now
Okay.
we had a gas stove. Right,
Okay, all right.
that replaced that. We didn't have a brick stove on there, okay? Now the ship, just to give you some idea, is 67 feet long and 19 feet wide. So it's a decent sized vessel.
And it's a masted sail
It has
boat?
a single sail, and this is what they used. It was a single mast, single sail vessel, which limited its abilities, but back in the day, that's what they had. And it could only sail before the wind, which is an interesting phrase when you think of Book of Mormon, because that's what Nephi said, we sailed before the wind,
What does that mean?
which gives you the sense that you can't, if you have two sails or you have the ability to pivot the sail, you can jibe, which means you can go into the wind or crosswind or even upwind. None of that's possible with the Phoenician.
This is unidirectional,
Yeah.
basically.
You go, and it literally is a seasonal travel because there's a certain season of the year where the winds blow one way and then another season they blow another way.
This
So the
is-
ship just follows with the seasonal
Goes
patterns.
wherever the wind takes it, essentially.
So the ships back in the day, and we're talking, so the Phoenicians actually ruled the seas for 1,500 years. This is, in fact, the whole Phoenician civilization, this is an amazing conversation, really has been written out of history. None of us studied Phoenician
No, you don't.
civilization in high school or college. Very few people ever do the studies of it, yet it was one of the most significant, important civilizations that ever existed. Why do we not know about it? And this is important, I think, because they were conquered, right? They were conquered by the Greeks and the Romans, and so they took on all of their technology, all of their skills, and all of their great innovations that they had invented and took them on themselves. So we credit the Romans with a lot of things that was actually given to them.
And would
from the
their
Phoenicians.
would their civilization then, and forgive my ignorance on this, but I mean, is it overlapping the times of the Book of Mormon and Lehi and, you know what I mean, where 600 BC were the Phoenicians ruling the seas then?
They absolutely were.
So their technology, their shipbuilding was extant. I mean, people knew about it. Would they
Yeah.
have?
Yeah, in fact, they were so dominant on the seas. There was no one else that sailed the open sea. They dominated, they ruled the seas. The Greeks, the Romans, anybody else who wanted to ship on the Mediterranean went to the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians, and because of that, and this is another cool thing, the Phoenicians had to develop a language that could communicate between the different parties because there were different languages and they were all ideogram or picture type languages. Very difficult to translate. So the Phoenicians, and this is where we get an interesting word, phonetic.
Oh yes.
The phonetic alphabet comes from the Phoenicians.
Oh, that does make
See?
sense now.
And
yeah.
so again, it's one of those things that comes that they never get credit for.
Yeah.
And they developed an alphabet with like 26 characters, and they each had a sound, and they could attach it to like Egyptian, and then attach it to another language, and Latin or Roman, whatever the paper speak, and they could all speak to each other. Although the Romans didn't have it until later on when they
I
borrowed
always wondered
it.
how they all communicated with
Yeah,
each
we talk
other.
about the Roman alphabet. It was actually the Phoenician alphabet.
Yeah.
Right.
So the boats now, were they just a regular boat that had masts and sails?
So these ships, the Phoenicia is 67 feet long. It's about 19 feet wide, has a 15-meter mast, and it has just one mast. Now, a lot of boats that you'll see, a lot of these sailboats.
Yeah, like
and
how
stuff,
long would these little sailboats back behind us be? Those are what, 20,
oh,
30
those
feet?
are going to be 20, 30 feet. So it's going to be
So
two or
it's
three
still
times
not a,
longer.
it's not a massive, it's not a cruise ship.
No.
I mean, is it the length of a really tall tree or like a couple of trees put together?
You know, they weren't dependent on that. They could make ships that were 200 feet long, and they did.
Because they were just,
They developed something during that era that they dominated the seas. The reason they did is because they had something called the Phoenician joint, which you can see in this image here. And these are really remarkable how they would join the timbers together so that it was extremely durable, extremely strong, and watertight.
man.
And so you can see from this diagram how this was all tied together.
So the
Pretty
world
amazing.
owes a lot, really, to the Phoenicians and their innovations.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much they contributed to the world that they haven't been given credit for.
It probably wouldn't be a stretch to say that they were possibly inspired too, even. I mean, I think
believe it.
most innovations, especially back then, had to have been of some sort of divine inspiration, wouldn't you think?
I would think so.
But to be able to put together a vessel that you then, so the vessel that you're on is a true to the facsimile of.
Excellent question, because a lot of people have said, well, if this is such a breakthrough, why didn't we do it 20 years? Why didn't Thor Heyerdahl do it? Right? Why did he go and get a rebuild? The reason is Jules Verne 7. Now, the Jules Verne 7 is an ancient wreck that was found off the coast of Marseille, France. And it was found in the mud. They were actually digging for a theater near the coastline, and they started hitting timbers, and they brought in archaeologists and found out they had discovered a 600 BC Phoenician sailing boat. And none had ever been found before that was intact enough to be able to put it back together. And this one was amazingly well preserved. You think about it, 2,600 years in the oxygen-free mud had preserved it there for that whole time. And because of that, we've always seen pictures. In fact, the ancient Greek urns and vases have beautiful paintings of these Phoenician ships. So they've always known that they existed and what they looked like, but no one knew how to build them or put them together until that Jules Verne 7 was found.
So are these, because now that you talk about urns and images, I'm seeing these in my mind's eye. I'm seeing kind of the bow and the stern kind of are
Yep.
are they
Curved
dug
prow.
out, or do they actually have a deck with below decks at all?
Yeah, well, you can see in these pictures right here how it was built. They have a spine that goes down the center, the keel, and then from there they attach what's called the whales or the side planks that come up, and then they have ribs that they attach last.
Okay.
Interestingly, a lot of people think you build the ribs first, but they would actually attach the ribs last. And you can see in this image, it shows how they did this. And then there is a deck built on top of that. So there's a below decks, which is where we
just
slept.
one below deck then?
Yeah.
Is it just one deck and then underneath
Actually,
is?
there's a below decks, and then there's a flat surface that you walk around on, below decks, and then beneath that is the ballast. And there's 30 tons of ballast on the ship. The ship weighs 50 tons.
What do they use for ballast? Just dirt?
Stone, rocks.
Stone and rocks.
Yeah.
Okay, and so then there's y'all. I live in Tennessee now, so I'm Southern. So there's y'all. There's 12 of you, roughly? Is that right?
In my leg, there was 11 of us.
11.
And so basically, we lived on 6-hour shifts. So you have to do everything when you're off shift. You do your washing, you do your showering, you do your laundry.
And how long is your off shift?
6
time?
hours. So you're on 6, off 6, on 6, and it just rotates around the clock that way.
Oh my.
So-
and then the 6 hours that you're on, are you doing different things each shift?
Yeah. So during that shift, it's a 6-hour shift, and every hour, all of the crewmen, the 6 crewmen on that shift,
They all rotate.
change through the 6 rotations.
So tell us some of the things that you had
All
to
right.
do.
Well, the probably the key one, the one everybody thinks about, is at the helm, where you're holding the tiller and actually keeping the ship on course. And you have a compass, and you're.
And this is a modern compass on this one, or was
it's
a sundial?
an old compass, but it's fairly modern.
Okay, all right.
But it's
fair enough.
And there's debate over what they had. I believe they did have compass technology, frankly. It's a fairly simple technology that they had in those days. I mean, to have that, considering all the other things they have. So,
Yeah.
but they haven't found any 600 BC compasses. So if you come across one, you know.
So one of your shifts, one of the hours of your 6-hour shift, you're actually steering the boat. You're the steerer.
Yeah, you're the skipper for 1 hour.
How are you knowing where to go?
So we have a compass, and the compass reads 270, and that's due west. And so you always want to keep, and it varies, the wind's shifting all the time, and so you have to just kind of keep it in that range so that you're constantly heading west with the wind. And you're also avoiding, so that's one of the jobs, right?
So what were besides steering the ship then, what were the other 5 duties do you remember what they are?
Yeah, you had cooking, cleaning, check, which is go around and check for all the things that you have to check, ropes for wear, and did I say look out? And that's where you literally stand on the bow and you're looking out.
You're king of the world.
Yeah, you're looking out because, especially at night, it's important because what happens at night is the biggest concern that we have on board the ship is having a freighter going 20 knots that's about 100 times bigger than we are, just take us out like a stick of wood. And so we have a radar on board, so we can actually see them by radar. That's required, and it's a good thing that it is. And we're able, if we're on a collision course with them, which happens quite frequently, we radio them and ask them to change course.
Because they probably can't see you.
No, you're
You're too small for them to blip. Yeah.
And most vessels would just move out of their way, but we have to tell them, no, we can't. You got to move out of our way.
We've got one sail, and it's blowing right at you.
That's exactly right.
Dink. That's all it would be. You guys would be completely devastated.
Sure.
Did you? I understand you ran into some tough weather even during the 3 weeks that you were on it.
We were headed west. Everything was going great. We go at about 5 knots.
How fast is that
per
in miles?
hour, and that's about 6 miles an hour.
Okay.
So we do about 100 miles a day. If we do 100 miles, we know we're on a good track. That's a good wind. That's when the sail is full. It's a great feeling. And we were heading west, and everything was good. And then we noticed the skies began to darken in the west. And within a few hours, it started to be looking like that scene from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, sailing into that blackened mist with lightning striking. And I was thinking to myself, I didn't dare ask anybody, but does lightning ever strike the mast? I mean, is that a thing, right? I didn't know.
Got to.
And so, but that didn't stop us. And so what we had to do was deploy the what's called a sea anchor. You can't throw an anchor out when you're in 1 mile deep of water. Okay, there's no
place
chain
for it
long
to,
enough.
yeah, it doesn't get purchased.
So what we did was we deploy a sea anchor, which is a sail. It was an emergency sail that we had, and we attach it to the anchor line, and we throw it out the bow of the ship, because what happened is the winds shifted on us 180 degrees. Now it was blowing due east, and we didn't want to go east, so we threw this anchor, which is just a sail, and drop it in the water. And so it's literally acting like a parachute, preventing the ship from being blown backwards.
Wow.
And it also keeps the bow into the wind, which is a really kind of a brilliant concept. And then the winds really started pounding, and the rains came, and the ship, Philip estimates we were between 15 and 20 foot swells, actually 15 meter swells.
Oh, wow.
And so they were pretty big. And
how was that? How did you feel? What was going through your mind?
You would ride up, it was like a roller coaster, and then you would go down into the trough. And yeah, it was pretty stomach turning. And although the amazing thing is, I never felt like the craft was going to break or fall apart.
Really?
No, the solidness of the design, I never felt like, oh no, she's going to break up. But the worst part for me and some of the other crew was just mal de mer, which is seasickness. And that does overtake you. And now I was fine for days, right? Until that moment.
Yeah.
And that really is hard. And I was actually on duty, and it was 10 o'clock, and my shift to go to the helm came up. And I exited, everybody was huddled down in the galley, trying to stay dry and warm. And so I exited out, had all my rain gear and everything, and a life jacket, which of course you're required during a storm to wear. And these are self-inflating life jackets. They have a little light beacon on them and so forth if they get into the water. And as I stepped out onto the deck, the ship was really rocking and water was coming over. And as I was heading back along the side of the galley, there's a safety rope that you just hold on to as you go along and keeps you safe. Well, right as I was reaching for the safety rope, a large wave on the starboard side just absolutely just shifted the ship at least a foot out to
Oh gosh.
out from under my feet. And my hand missed the rope, and I got caught by the railing right here just above the knee, and I was going overboard. And I had one of those moments where I remembered all the things that Steiner had taught us. He was the ship's first mate, and he was a Viking captain on a Viking replica ship. But he told us all about what not to do so that you stay alive during the expedition. And the worst thing you can ever do is fall overboard during a storm, because
Well, I think that's a fairly obvious. Yeah.
so
I can't think of anything worse than
yeah,
that.
no, it would have been, and so all that was going through my mind as well as my entire life, because the outcome is pretty grim if you do fall over.
Right. Yeah.
You can't turn the ship around and go pick them up,
Right.
right? It's not an option. And so, anyway, as that happened, I found myself teetering on my whole body. All I wanted to do was get my gravity down to the ground.
Yeah.
And I brought myself down, and I was on the rail, literally just balancing on the rail. And I will just call it a miracle. I had another wave that hit the other side of the ship, pushed it back, and allowed
so
my
that
gravity to fall inside the rail instead of outside. And that was a real wake-up moment for me.
And this was still in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, oh yeah,
I mean, they haven't even breached the Atlantic.
right. Yeah, it's in the Mediterranean, and I just blame myself. I wasn't being as careful, as cautious as I should have been, being a little bit cavalier and not. Anyway, so I did finally make it back and traded the guy off at the stern, and took the helm for an hour. And I was just glad. I didn't care if it was raining. I was just glad to be alive and on board.
When you read, you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and even if you weren't, if you read the Book of Mormon, but you are and you do, what is it different to you now when you read those chapters and you read about the people, the Jaredites and the Mulekites and Lehi and Nephi and those
Here,
that?
Scott, I'm going to do a scripture shift on you, because what I really had an epiphany about was Jonah and
Oh.
his experience.
Okay.
So if you look up Jonah and the whale, it turns out Jonah was sailing on a Phoenician vessel. This happened this was right around 700 BC, I believe. And he was sailing from Joppa, which is the coast of Israel, and he was sailing to Tarshish, which is modern day Cadiz, Spain.
Cadiz.
Cadiz.
Yes.
Yes.
Is it really?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
That is Tarshish.
I did not
And
know
it's
that.
a 2,500 mile journey from Joppa to Tarshish, or to Cadiz. And he was on that voyage, and a tremendous storm came up on the Mediterranean. And ultimately he was the victim to go over, and all of that came to me. It was only afterward that I really put all this together and
But wait a
realized
minute,
that
wait, now.
there was no whale.
I was going to say,
No. So I just had that reality really hit me in a major way. I mean, the scriptures are not just stories. They're actually real things that happen to real people. That was one of the things that really struck me
I'll bet.
in that voyage. And then in the other aspects of it, I had there's a few nights later, probably a week later, while sailing at night, I had a real epiphany. You asked about that before.
Yeah.
And that happened while the stars were out. It was crystal clear night. The stars seemed so close. And I was sailing by the stars. And the way you can do that is the stars all go around the North Star, which the Phoenicians knew. They discovered that and made it part of their navigation technology. But if you know the pattern of the stars and how they rotate and where they will drop on the horizon, you can pinpoint a star and say, as that star drops behind the horizon, if I follow that, I'll be going west. And then if you know the arc of the stars around the North Star, you can pick which stars will also be continuing to point west. And so it's actually navigating at night the easiest, as long as you have stars to see.
Because you had to navigate at night.
Well, we did have
you
the compass,
have
but I actually tried to avoid the compass and just use the stars. And during that moment, I really felt like, wow, this is me 2,600 years ago on a Phoenician vessel. And it's like, time is really kind of irrelevant when you realize that these things all actually happened and real people lived back then and they did these things.
That's so cool. And then ultimately you got off where?
Cadiz.
Oh, that's where you
I
got
got
off
off
from Tarshish.
with Jonah where he wanted to go.
That's where you
I
ended.
made it to
And
his
so
destination.
then Philip and the rest, they kept heading. They went and they made it. They made it to the Americas.
They made
We
it.
know
They
that.
they made so the voyage is real to real cap it is they went from Cadiz down to Essaouira, Morocco, and they had a big celebration there. The Moroccans love the whole Phoenician expedition, and it's a big deal back there. Let me just tell you, this whole
But
voyage.
that was wind driven. I mean,
Yes.
obviously.
Yeah.
So again, they are their course is west.
But they went south for that leg because you have to go south to get their ultimate goal
Through the
is to get to the Canary Islands. Because the Canary Islands is Tenerife. There's a port in Tenerife, which is a Phoenician port. It's got ancient Phoenician
No
artifacts
kidding.
everywhere in Tenerife, Canary Islands, and from there is where you really that's technically where the crossing of the Atlantic begins, and that's exactly where Columbus began his voyage as well.
That's right. Yeah.
And what's amazing is then from there, Tenerife, they sailed across the Atlantic and arrived in the Dominican Republic in approximately the same number of days, 37, 38 days, which is exactly what Columbus did.
Really that fast?
Yeah.
I thought it was 5 months.
5 months when you add in all the waits and stop times and crew changes.
Oh,
and-
okay. Okay.
yeah. It wasn't 5 months on the water. It was literally just 37 days to cross the entire Atlantic. And it's a tribute to the fact that the seas are the seas and the currents have been what they've been for
Yeah.
thousands of years. They don't change.
Yeah. And so now we know that a boat made in the style of the Phoenicians, having been patterned after one that was found that was thousands of years old, building that boat with a few modern necessities on board, we now know that a boat could leave from the coast off of, it left from Carthage,
which
but
is Tunisia.
which is in the Mediterranean.
Yep.
It could have gone through the Mediterranean and through and down by the Canary Islands, across the Atlantic, to somewhere in the Americas.
Yep.
We now have seen
Literally,
that.
because of what Philip Beale has done, the history books have to be rewritten because so many of them say there's no one before Columbus, that other maybe a Viking contact or something like that. But the whole story really changes. This sets a whole new dynamic because, yeah, the Phoenicians could have been blown here by accident, or they could have had a whole trade route, and there's a whole argument. out there about that.
Is there evidence then that they actually made it there? I mean, the boat that was found, where was that found again?
Off the coast of France?
Okay, off France. So
In the
do we know
Mediterranean.
if there's any Phoenician boat evidence in the Americas at all?
There
Anything?
is Phoenician evidence in the Americas.
Oh, there
Absolutely,
is?
yes.
Okay.
One of the
Like
most
of the culture?
famous or well-known is it's called the Paraibo Stone, and it's in Brazil, and it's a cliff side that had Phoenician writing carved into the cliff, and it's written in pure Phoenician. And back in the 1800s, this was found, discovered, and translated, and it says, "We are a group of sailors who were part of 12 other ships that were blown off course. May the gods help us, find our country and our fellow men," or words to that effect.
And they believe that's authentic? I mean,
They
that
believe it's authentic. Now, unfortunately, the rock's gone now, right?
Oh.
There are images of it.
Did he wrote it, or
No, I think
people
somebody it's probably in
defaced it?
some private museum somewhere. Who knows?
Oh, okay.
It's just gone.
Okay. Okay.
But that's there. There's also a lot of other artifacts that have been found that have indications of Phoenician civilization on them, but they're always controversial, right? Because again, the history books say that didn't happen. You can't have that. And so anything that does show up is immediately considered fraudulent or questionable. And so yes, there are a lot of artifacts that purport to be Middle Eastern and have those kind of evidences to them, but modern archaeologists, for the most part, dismiss those.
But at least, again, having that vessel that you guys were on that made it all the way, we can say that at least it was possible and very probable that pre-Columbian transoceanic voyages were possible and possibly actually occurred.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's fair. Were there ever any problems with the boat, or do you have to fix it?
Yes, actually, after that storm that we talked about,
Oh, right, yeah.
the mast cracked, and so we saw up at the very top of the mast what was appearing to be a crack coming down the mast, but we couldn't get up there to really check it out and look into it. And so we had no choice but to pull into a port. The only port nearby was Algiers. Now, Algiers is a closed country. No one goes in there. It's very, and so Captain Beale was very concerned about taking the ship into Algiers, but again, because of his concerns we had with the mast and its condition, we had no choice. So as we got closer to the Algerian coastline, sure enough, the orange Coast Guard came to greet us, and
I'm sure they were.
Oh yeah,
they were packing.
well armed, and they thought we were a drug ship or who knows what they thought.
Yeah,
It wasn't.
Somalians.
They didn't greet us happily, and they said, "We shall escort you from here." They were very in their PA system.
Did they at least help you fix the mast?
Well, no,
or?
they escorted us in.
So
they
did.
took us in.
Oh, they escorted you in. I thought you meant they escorted you
us
out.
into the harbor because we had requested permission to enter, and they did. And they brought us in, and we moored there, and we were there 3 days, making repairs and trying to get out of Algiers, which with their customs and their police and their
Did you stay in a hotel or something while you were there?
Yeah, we stayed in the boat.
You just stayed, yeah.
Yeah, and they didn't let us off the dock. We were stuck on this pier, on this dock, for the first entire day. I mean, we had access to a restroom facility, but they were pretty Spartan. But finally, we talked the dock controller, the top guy there, into letting us go into town. And so he took me and a few others in his car and drove us all around in Algiers and learned a lot of interesting things.
What must they have thought when they see this freaking Phoenician weird boat coming into their...
It was unlike anything they'd ever seen.
Shores. And was everyone on it like European, American?
The crew is an international crew. There's several people from the United Kingdom.
Okay.
Several Brits. We had a doctor from Holland. We had 2 Indonesians, and these guys were amazing. They were our shipwrights, and they could take care of things when they broke, and they could fix anything with baling wire and duct tape and rope. They were pretty amazing. And then we had a Canadian, and I actually had my fellow Latter-day Saint, Doug Petty, was on board with us as well. And
were you the only 2 Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, and he brought his son also, Carson. So that made 3 of us.
Now, did it ever come up? I mean, when you're with these guys, did you tell them about why this voyage is significant to you?
Some were interested, some didn't ever ask or care.
Yeah.
We actually had a reporter on board that worked for the London Times. And her name was Tom, and she was very interested in our connection and our interest in the ship, and so had a lot of questions.
Did you ever see the article? I mean, was that ever...
She didn't write an article about that. She did write an article about the Phoenicia expedition.
Yeah.
But not about the...
So was that the name of the boat, the Phoenicia? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm writing a book called The Passage of Mulek, because I believe that this expedition was a replica, a replay of Mulek's voyage.
Oh, really?
So
Nephi didn't build his boat after the manner of men. That wouldn't have been this one that we're talking about.
But it was built out of hewn timbers.
Okay.
Right? So we knew it was built out of wood, basically.
Right.
It was a wooden vessel. And we don't know exactly what Nephi's ship was like. It was obviously a well-constructed vessel. But what's interesting is that the Phoenicians had been at it for over 1,000 years, perfecting their art and their technology.
Right.
And what we learn in Omni is that Zedekiah had sons. And Zedekiah, of course, was the king in Jerusalem
Yeah.
at the time of the siege when the Babylonians came in. And what happened is, we learned that Zedekiah was captured and his sons in Byblos were all brought there, and they were murdered in front of Zedekiah. It was the last thing he saw, because then they put out his eyes and kept Zedekiah alive and took him back in chains to Babylon as a witness that he had no heirs to the throne. And that was a big deal. The Babylonians were very concerned about some party rising up and claiming heirship to the throne and causing a revolution. So they made sure there were no descendants left of Zedekiah's. Now, what's really interesting is in the Book of Mormon, we learn what the Bible doesn't know, that there was one son who escaped. And in my book, I'm suggesting that the reason he escaped, first of all, Zedekiah was 31 years old. He's not an old man. These aren't like adult sons. These are children, basically.
Right.
And so his youngest son, we will call Mulek, that would be his youngest son, I believe escaped in the womb of his mother. Undetected by the Babylonians, unknown to anybody, probably other than his mother.
And so that's the Mulek that then eventually sails.
Yeah, so Hugh Nibley tells us that Mulek, the name itself, means little king or dear little king. It's an term of endearment about a king. And so we know he was young. How young, we don't know, but had he been born, that would have been a matter of record, and the Babylonians would have tracked him down.
Yeah.
So I think that he probably had not been born, and his mother had been able to escape before the siege. And then in Omni it says that they traveled through the wilderness and then were carried across the seas to the promised land. So there's no talk about building a ship. They were carried.
So these would have been ships that were already.
That's my conclusion. Is
Yeah.
that and she's a queen, so she has means, resources, an entourage, no doubt helping her. So she's able to go and buy passage, if you will, on a Phoenician ship and say, take me to where the Lord's sending us.
Yeah.
And clearly what's really amazing to me about this is you go back to Genesis 49 verse 10, where Israel is giving the blessings to his sons, and one of them to Judah, he blesses him that the scepter shall never depart from thee. And the Jews have always assumed that that meant that the kingship would continue, which it did,
Right.
from the Davidic line down through. Well, Zedekiah ended that, but in the Lord's economy, it didn't end with Zedekiah. He took the youngest son and brought him to another promised land and placed him there. So it's an
I'm going to
amazing
want to read
portion.
that book when you've got it. That'll be fun to read. Yeah. What was kind of the conclusion for you from going on this trip?
So
ultimately, what you took away from it?
Yeah, what I take away from it is that there is a civilization of antiquity that very few people know about, called the Phoenician civilization, that had a huge impact on the world today. And one of the things that I'm convinced they were doing is sailing across the great seas.
Yeah.
And this expedition literally proved that they were capable, that their ships were capable of doing that. And also it's important to note, this ship was certified by marine archaeologists as being a truly authentic replica Phoenician vessel.
That's really important. Yeah, I love that. So there you have it. We have essentially proof that that kind of maritime technology existed and that it was effective, that people made it, or that they could have made it, which is exactly what we're hoping to. And then, of course, the experiences that you had on board are priceless. Thank you so much
Hey,
for
thank you.
your willingness to be here and in a lovely setting and
Linden Harbor.
relive it all. I appreciate it.